Welcome to a special Ask Us Anything session of Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani, your host. This is where panelists from the London Center answer your questions. If you'd like to submit a question for consideration, feel free to send us one via social media or my email, ccordani@londoncenter.org. The London Center's Twitter page is @the LCPR. We're also on Facebook, and you can find us on LinkedIn. We also have a YouTube channel, and our Patreon page is patreon.com/thought-to-action. This edition of Ask Us Anything is available to the public. They will soon be exclusive to Patreon members. And if you'd like to help us produce such content like this, and of course enjoy more exclusive programming, feel free to be part of our Patreon page and help us out there. Patreon.com/thought-to-action. Our panelists for today: the president of the London Center, Tony Shaffer; Distinguished Fellow Pete O'Brien; Senior Fellow Tim Wilson; and Senior Fellow Jay Homnick. Another great way to help us out is to comment on this video and share it with others on social media. Gentlemen, the first question comes from Angie L. With the 2020 presidential election results still under scrutiny, we hear two terms constantly: election fraud and election impropriety. What is the difference between the two, and why is this distinction important?
Elections fraud is a deliberate action, in my view, to add votes to a candidate that he didn't actually get, or in some way to actually disenfranchise voters by taking away votes that have been cast properly. So fraud is basically a criminal action. Impropriety, in my view, would be the actions where officials, for example, do not follow the rules, maybe through not understanding them fully, or through the best of good intentions, but failing to follow the law, election law, and mishandling of documents or equipment because they don't understand fully the situation.
And let me jump on and continue the answer. The impropriety pieces Tim said is important to note when you have officials who run the election simply don't actually follow laws, rules, regulations, or procedures. And the most prominent, I think it's going to be legally expressed, is the Dominion voting systems. And not only Dominion, all the voting systems, because many of these were improperly certified or not certified at all. If you do that as a deliberate act, that's an impropriety because it's not certified. And foreseeably then, if things are updated by the manufacturer, that update is put into play without any recertification. Remember, the Dominion system is 4 machines. There's 4 different components that have to synchronize and work together. So if those things are not synchronized, if they don't actually work as designed, that is to say, and there's an update that makes it even more likely that they don't synchronize, an official has then worked improperly, in impropriety, if you will, to allow the machine to be used for voting. That's one thing. So that is kind of one of the best examples. Now, the intention behind that, in my judgment, they knew that. They didn't want to certify because they knew that there was a certain percentage it was just going to go awry, and it benefited them. So I would argue then that comes to potential fraud if we can prove intent. But as Tim said, for fraud, you got to kind of prove intent, that someone really was planning with a forethought the actual events or outcomes to change the vote. So one is just basically neglect, basically criminal neglect maybe, but still neglect. And then one is with intent to actually defraud or change. And that was where some of the other actions we've observed with officials taking, whole bags of votes out from under tables when all the Republican observers are out. That's fraud. That's fraud right there. And the Atlanta counting video, I think, is the best and most clear example of dead to rights fraud. So I hope that helped.
If I can give another one as well, impropriety would include things like breaking the chain of custody of ballot papers, for example, which again, impropriety would be that that for some reason the system breaks down where somebody who's supposed to take on part of that chain of custody is not available, or the logbook that shows that chain of custody is lost.
Right.
As long as there's no deliberate action in that, that's an impropriety. But if somebody steals that election log, for example, that is fraud.
If I may add, too, Saturday, one of the talking heads in Washington made a comment that there may have been fraud, but it wasn't enough to affect the election. And I just want to throw in something here, sort of a simple thought experiment. Why would anyone commit fraud in an election if it wasn't to throw the election, to affect it? The idea is lunacy. Oh, let's just go add a few votes for laughs. Come on. The fact of the matter is that if there is any fraud, the intent of the fraud is to affect the outcome. The question then becomes can you show that the data, all the counts of ballots, has somehow been affected to the point where I can't get an accurate picture? If I can't get an accurate picture, an accurate count of what in fact happened, my database is tainted, and now I have no ability to actually come up with an answer that has true, if you will, integrity. And at that point, I would submit that as a citizen, I would insist that the vote be thrown out, that something else, that there be some other resolution. And I think that's the argument that needs to be addressed.
Now, on the second part of the question of why the difference is important, which is the question of remedies, other than this, the remedy of it's so ruined that we have to throw the whole thing out. And there is a possibility to penalize one party for fraud if we can link it back to them. So on impropriety, no matter how, unless we find an impropriety of 1 million votes that were improperly done, if we don't get a judge to throw out the entire election, then we're not going to get them to have a remedy that will change the winner, because they'll say, all right, let's ignore that 1 million votes. We'll take them more proportionately, and you're still going to have the same proportion. You're just going to have less votes. You may shrink the margin, but you won't be able to shift the winner. However, there's a type of fraud where we could argue for a remedy of penalizing the party. So, for example, right now in Nevada, there's a margin of 30,000 votes, and there's 40,000 and change people who voted twice. So that's a matter of public record. There's no investigation needed. They voted twice. So it's possible to argue as a remedy that we should take the votes off the party. We should assume, based on the registrations of the people who voted twice, let's assume they voted twice for their party. And if that would be the case, so that's not impropriety, that's because of fraud, we could say, so if it turns out that all 40,000 of those people who voted twice were Democrats, we could make a case saying, Your Honor, the remedy should be, let's take the 40,000 votes off the Democrat candidate, and now Trump wins the state of Nevada.
But in fact, shouldn't you penalize them and say that those 40,000 people should have their votes rescinded? In which case, there's an 80,000 vote count shift.
Exactly. The second vote should be rescinded. And it's
right. Well, both their votes should be rescinded.
Right. Even though it's a private vote, we don't know who they voted for, but we can make the assumption they voted for the party of registration.
This question comes from Mark B. No matter who is determined to be the winner of the 2020 presidential election, our system is compromised in the eyes of arguably tens of millions of people here in the U.S. How do we fix that?
Well, I'll go first on this just to set the scene. What we saw before the election, before the 3rd of November, was a run-up of a huge psychological operation that combined the powers of the Democrat Party, big tech, and big media. There was a constant drumbeat of Trump being down 10 points and it's all over. And I think that was set up for purposes of what we're seeing now, is to convince people beyond a shadow of a doubt through the mainstream media that Trump lost. This was deliberate. I would argue all the polls showing 10-point differences were deliberate. It was a deliberate lie. It was a psychological operation. So that's the first piece we have to consider regarding, do I want to, you know, was there a conspiracy? Yes, there was a conspiracy. Was it something that someone sat down in some dark room and planned out? Maybe, I don't know. But you can see for yourselves the pattern. So that's number one. Number two, then, if you look at the fraud of the actual night, it wasn't everywhere, but it was predominantly in urban areas, which the Democrats have traditionally controlled forever. And I would argue in 2016, the same cheating went on, but they just weren't prepared for the overwhelming wave of votes for Trump. And even this time, I would argue, since the president picked up votes, they weren't quite prepared, because it was their last minute cheats from midnight to 5 a.m. were obvious. That basically they anticipated a 2016 turnout, and it was more. So therefore, you have all these indicators of what happened. So the first thing, I'll just finish here in a second, but let the group kind of address it further. The first thing you have to do in any situation like this is identify how they did it, to basically do a retrospective, identify the method, the means, and motivation of the cheat. We all know it happened. Now we have to analyze it. And no matter what the outcome is, no matter who takes the oath on 20 January, this has to be something we need to do as an accountability center, which, we have, as well as really help the American people understand that this sort of thing, this has gone on for probably decades. This is not new. This is something that's been refined. And the way this was all portrayed as a psyop, as the night of, the red wave being a red mirage, which was heavily messaged, and then all of the different shenanigans after the fact, where everything said there was no evidence of voter fraud. These are not the droids you're looking for. That's what happened. So that's what we have to look at, I think, as we go into 2021, no matter what.
There's one major factor that I think is really important to understand as well. Following the 2000 Bush v. Gore election, this country moved very quickly towards computerized electronic voting systems. And the problem is that, amongst other things, the security on those systems has not moved forward with the times. And even if it had, as a legal immigrant, I first voted in 2012. And I was not happy with the New York State election system, whereby I filled in a ballot, and then it went into a scanner, and that was it. I was told I'd voted. I had no confirmation as an individual citizen of who the system had registered my vote for. And when you think about all the online fraud that goes on all the time, the hacking of data out of government and private systems and individual firms, and the way banks have to spend literally billions every year protecting their customers. And we look at an election system that spends a few $100 million every few years on what are basically antiquated electronic and computerized systems. You can't have any faith in it. I do not believe there is an electronic system in the world at the moment that isn't at least theoretically hackable.
I think you also have a very big problem to live in a country with two political parties. And essentially, we all have an expectation that one of them is honest and one of them is a bunch of crooks. And then every election is now, okay, can we develop an honest enough system to control those crooks into one party? It's an insane way to live as a civilized society. Simple as that.
Well, isn't the whole idea of the election system in this country being that, for example, there should be an observer from each of those two major political parties able to actually observe sufficient to ensure themselves and others that their candidate is not being cheated? And this business about observers being kept 6 to 60 to 600 feet away, or even denied access to a precinct counting station, is just, it's it's un-American, if I can put it that way.
But notice that it never happens the other way. You never have Republican areas where they're keeping the Democrats out in left field. You basically have a structure where one party seems to be honest and the other party seems to be looking to cheat at every opportunity. If you, in the schoolyard, if there was a kid that would always want to cheat, you stop playing with him after a while. But over here, we don't have a choice. We're stuck every time
to
doing
take
it
that
around.
analogy further, Jay, I'm not sure I completely agree with that. I'm sure that if Republicans could cheat, they would, and probably do in some places. But at the end of the day, the two major school gangs in the schoolyard need the teacher there, or the monitors, who are if you like the older kids, who to act as not referees but sort of as police, to actually police to make sure it is a fair system, both sides. And that's what's gone badly wrong in this election. One side is completely dissatisfied, as you say, millions, tens of millions of people are actually convinced that this election has been fiddled with.
If I can add in, the part of the problem here is actually part of it's mechanical, part of it is philosophical. And there's a mechanical process issue here where over the last several decades, in fact, the first ones that I know of were back in the 70s, we started adding machines to the voting process. And the problem is that, as we have all discovered when we find some kind of virus on our cell phone, is if it's a cell phone, if it's a thing that's controlled by software, the software can be infected. And you can spend a great deal of money and perhaps protect your machinery, your equipment from some kind of virus, but you're probably pushing a rope when it comes to something as prolific as a voting machine spread around the nation. If the concern is to have integrity of the voting process, the first thing that comes to mind is let's go to hand counts. Let's go to paper ballots and hand counts. Now, people say, well, that's antiquated and will take too long. My answer is we still have a few voting totals out here a month later, right, that are on machine, and we still don't have a count. We could have counted this by hand half a dozen times if we had simply counted the ballots and got some people lined up. Right. So it's not time. And so if you want an accurate and if you will, scientifically replicated capability to get a vote count, go to paper ballots. The other piece to it, though, is who gets the vote. And the control of voter tolls, the control of IDs, the control of the actual access to the voting booth process is a philosophical difference between, if you will, the conservative side of the country and the liberal side of the country. And there needs to be, if you will, a headbanging contest here to decide whether we're going to go to the leftist perspective, which is everybody who's in America gets to vote, to the rightist issue, which is no, only those who are clearly American citizens get to vote. And so that question sits at the heart of this whole process. Who actually gets to vote? And it's an interesting question that has come up time and time again in other elections. If I would recommend to everybody who hasn't done it is go read Robert Caro's biography on Lyndon Johnson and take a look at some fairly well documented cases of cheating in Texas back in the 40s and 50s.
Part of I think what we need to look at is, to Pete's point, there were states that got this right. I mean, Florida and Texas got this right. It wasn't that difficult. And right. While I agree with Pete on the hand count issue, I'd much rather have a system that's reliable and deliberate rather than one that's erratic and unpredictable. And I think we could all agree on that. It's like, I would argue, going back to the first question, the issue of impropriety, I think these certain Democrat jurisdictions picked that system, which would create the most chaos because it gives them an advantage. It gives all these blind spots to do things.
You're using the fog.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you need to look at what worked, take an example from that. Again, I think Governor DeSantis, and I was in contact with his staff, his chief of staff on this issue. Florida was very confident that they could handle the COVID issues as well as do the vote honestly. Do I think they were still cheating there? Yeah, I do. But I think DeSantis and company were able to organize around an honest system using the policy access they had to make sure it worked better than everywhere else. And I think I would argue that the margin of victory is probably even higher in Florida than what we know. But that argues then for a full audit, even of those states which got it right.
Right.
I know one of our colleagues, Bennett McFadder, is going to be doing a deep analysis of some of these states that are friendly to us, because they're going to be willing to give up the data. But I would argue the data is going to show there were cheats there as well. It's just that it was hidden more tactically than.
And if I can add, Tony, that as soon as any of this data starts entering into a machine that's controlled by software, and you have a question about the software, is the software doing exactly what it's supposed to do? As soon as you have that question, then you get into a situation where no matter how well intentioned and how well organized the state, that machine over there could have been doing something that no one will see, and it will be a month later virtually impossible to find exactly what it did to that data.
It also raises the point about foreign interference. We know that the American intelligence community has used software to interfere in foreign elections, and they've done it without being detected. How do we know that a state bad actor has not interfered in our election through our electronic systems just because we haven't found any proof of it?
That leads us to the next question. We have a Senate election, a special election coming up in Georgia. That's a Dominion state. Tony, you testified way before all of this, and that's on record.
Yeah.
I warned Georgia about this, but they're going to go ahead with another election, a runoff, and it's Dominion-based. How do we trust that?
Well, we don't trust it by not voting or participating, as Sidney Powell has proposed. I think that's a very dangerous proposition that, we're just not going to play. I don't think that's the right answer. Georgia, I'm talking to people in Georgia on a daily basis. It's bad down there by the fact that I think I'll just say this: they're on the brink of a civil war, because I think a lot of people recognize what happened, and especially with the video coming out, and the government, the central government, even though it's Republican, are very dismissive of the fraud and other anomalies which have been observed, which is very dangerous. Georgia is not a blue state, just saying. I mean, I don't know what people are thinking. And if you start doing things which are obviously degrading the integrity of a system, which in this case elections, it's obvious, and it's not going to go without some response.
Do you think, Tony, that there's been some, how should we put it? A lot of legislators are not computer experts by any means. Some of them may even not be computer familiar, particularly. They might be good on their phone, but they take what they regard as experts' words for it, for how secure these election systems are. And there do seem to have been an awful lot of experts at various levels. And I'm thinking here in particular of the cyber guy that just resigned from the federal government, who said this was the most secure election ever. I find that, from any form of cyber expert, incredible.
Well, first off, just look at how long did he have to assess that fact? That he stipulated this fact saying, it's the most secure ever. How did you arrive at that within like days? Yeah. Anyone who understands computer systems would understand that a full audit would be required of at least, I would say, 2 to 3 months to come to that conclusion. If you're doing it like, I really want to get to the bottom of this. And I think the fact that that was a political statement, not a tactically accurate statement, is why he got him fired. Because anyone who understands this, for anyone who's done any computer stuff, you cannot assess that in like a few days. Like, oh yeah, everything's fine. What he should have said is, to date, we have seen no obvious foreign interference, but we're going to do a detailed evaluation, and it'll take about 3 months to get to. That's the appropriate response from a bureaucrat.
And if just to add on to that, Tony, for those folks out there who are listening to us who are not necessarily familiar with some of the processes involved in validating an event like this, if you really wanted to do what Tony suggests and get to the bottom of the whole process, you would need to do a thorough scrub of the software. And doing a thorough scrub of several 100,000 lines of code
Right.
It's not something that takes place in a day or two.
Right.
It's something that is going to take, if you're lucky and you have some really top end people working on it in the right environment with the right gear, it may take a couple of months. And if the folks who constructed that software are particularly clever, it may take substantially longer than that.
And there's two factors here to add to Pete's point. First off, you're talking about third-party vendors, which are never keen on giving you access to the code. And in some of these machines, according to Ben McFadder, we're talking about 500,000 lines of code, 500,000 per machine. And the idea that, and I don't, you're never going to be able, like, never is a wrong word. The manpower required to check every machine would be unbelievable. So what the best you're going to be able to do is do a sampling. You do a random sampling of different machines, examining the day of software profile, the image, and you go through that. And this is, you'd have to have a plan to do this. You'd have a 100-page plan to do what Pete and I are talking about here. And the plan itself wouldn't be done within the time after the election that this knucklehead was saying, oh, nothing to see here. So it's preposterous. It's dangerous, and it was done as a political statement. It was not a tactically accurate or a legally feasible statement to defend. And he rightfully was fired for making a completely insane statement, which I would argue reinforced the perception that the left has been pushing, that this election was completely fair and above board. We all know it's not. So to me, it's destructive. It is
also an interesting about face from 4 years ago, when many of them at very senior levels were pushing the narrative that the computer systems were unreliable, and the previous election was stolen.
Well, in fact, Tim, you pushed out to us about a week ago, I think, a copy of the study completed by a Democratic Congress caucus on voting across the United States. They looked at, I think, from 2000 to 2006. They collected all the data, and their answer was, these voting machines are no good. We need to go back to paper ballots.
Yep.
Right. But about Georgia, as I said on the last edition of Ask Us Anything, I think that the Republicans have very little chance of winning either one of those seats, and they really need to be thinking ahead of what happens if they lose them both. I acknowledge that we need to be, that if you are a Republican, which of course we're nonpartisan, but I acknowledge that Republicans should be working hard, try their best to win it. But I think the odds are really against them, because you have all the forces of Democrat support, which is,
you raise an interesting point, Jay, because what you're basically saying is that Atlanta is the political center of the whole state of Georgia. So where Georgia is a red state, as Tony said, rightly, in my view, anything that goes on in Atlanta can, if you like, overrule. And it's almost the Washington syndrome versus flyover country. The elites sitting, or particular parties sitting in one place, can expand their influence far wider than they perhaps should be able to. And the answer to that has to be vote in the right people.
Well, yes and no, Tim. The answer has to be putting cuffs on those who were engaged in fraud directly.
Absolutely.
I mean, let me be very clear on this. And I'm going to be a little bit mysterious right now. And I've had a conversation with someone who's intimately involved in this issue regarding the fraud issue, regarding some of the issues that we have investigated. I've been involved in directly, and I don't know when this is going to come out. There may be already information out about what I'm alluding to this, but the bottom line is, the moment you observe fraud to the level that you see that it had the potential to affect the outcome of an election, and you have people who were directly involved in it, there should be essentially criminal charges brought immediately and cuffs put on those people, because until you start to fight and show that this level of fraud is not acceptable, they're going to continue to do it.
Yep.
So to me, it's unconscionable. No matter what, I don't care what party you are. If you have people on video pulling suitcases of pristine ballots out, and then in the case of that one woman, seen running them through 2 and 3 times, that act alone was probably likely sufficient. That act of fraud was likely sufficient to have changed the outcome of the Georgia election, period.
Right.
So,
the total was 18,000. The suggestion was 18,000 count.
right.
Votes.
So when you see that and you see no direct action taken by the elements of justice, either the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, people are just sitting there scratching their head. Well, you know, maybe we should try to find some other explanation. Maybe you should go out and put the cuffs on people and do your job. And I think that's the first thing that has to be done in Georgia, is because this has been sustained. People were so arrogant to the point that this person in particular was doing videos about how important her work is to work on the election. That's just unacceptable. And it's not the American way. Or I should say it should not become the American way, which has been the way it has been.
And that's what I wanted to add in, Tony and Tim, is that, as you were saying, Tim, as far as what this election might represent, the fear here is this election may in fact represent the future of elections in the United States, in that it doesn't really matter who votes, it matters who counts.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you go back 2 months and look at Atlanta and you look at local sampling, both those guys, both those Republican candidates were going to clearly win.
Yep.
And suddenly it is just as Jay says, it is strangely suspicious, but likely possible that neither of them will win.
Well, as you guys said, the American way, I mean, the founding fathers really were geniuses, and they were very aware that they deliberately set up a system that made sure that the 2 or 3 major East Coast cities did not run America.
Right.
And that's supposed to be the system. That's the whole purpose of the Electoral College and the way that's set up. And bringing it back down, the idea that Atlanta should control the whole of Georgia seems equally wrong.
Well, especially since they don't, but they prime the pump with fake votes to do it. I mean, that's what, again, it's unconscionable and illegal both.
I think there's a very important messaging error that the Trump people are doing in terms of the suitcase ballot. Because they're not they're saying it's inappropriate, it's suspicious, it's all these funny words. It has to be regarded as evidence that every single one of those ballots was pre-filled out for bug. Or they have to keep saying, it's not that they did more than they were supposed to when no one was looking. They had no reason to do that box more than any other box when no one was looking. If they made sure to clear everyone out, that's criminal evidence that those all Biden ballots, all of them, 100%.
Well, they weren't 100% Biden, but I know what you're saying. They basically, the spike is observed as part of the election night data, and it was something like 9 or 10 to 1, something like that.
Yeah, so they knew that they had a set of ballots that were way out of whack, and they wanted to wait for the moment to ram them in. So, yes. But by law, those should all be regarded as should be taken off Biden's count. Right. And that's the end of the Georgia. Then Trump wins Georgia.
Right.
Well, it's also interesting, isn't it, how we've had to go back to supposedly paper recounts to verify all of these troubled areas. And yet we're supposedly using an electronic voting system, which kind of reinforces.
Well, I think that's going to be the key. Well, that's going to be the key now, is to actually going back, doing the signature verification, the full audit of the election. I think that's what's going to be highly important to whatever happens.
Absolutely. Why bother with the electronic voting system is my question.
Also, Colonel Waldron, who's been testifying at each one of these state hearings with Giuliani. Colonel Waldron points out that we have available to us, but no one's doing it, a spectrographic forensic way of telling whether a thing was run off on a machine or whether an actual person filled in an ink ballot. And that is a terrible flaw in the system, that they can just run off copies and then feed them into this tablet.
So notable on Colonel Waldron, one of our senior fellows actually works for him, Robin Gritz. So I know for a fact that he's a great guy and he's doing his best to try to get all this information out. But to Jay's point, this needs to be echoed in every single hearing out there that can be if, you know, included in it. So
if I can just add in, Tony and Jay, is that people will, you know, you hear people say, well, let's get this done with, and let's actually get it right rather than hurry. This is, we're talking about the integrity of the national government. Let's take a little extra time to get this thing right. And oh, by the way, you know, people moaning about Trump not conceding the election, they should go back and check the history. Al Gore never conceded.
Stacey Abrams never conceded in Georgia.
Right. Stacey Abrams never conceded.
Well, there you go.
We hope you're enjoying our Ask Us Anything edition of Thought to Action, presented by the London Center for Policy Research. If you'd like to help us produce more content like this and enjoy exclusive programming, as well as preview these shows and the Thought to Action programs before everyone else, please feel free to join our Patreon page, our Patreon community, patreon.com/thought-to-action. Also, it would really help us out if you liked, commented, and shared this video on social media. Show your friends, spread the word. This question comes from Bill J. Gentlemen. What resources are available for cybersecurity information to stay up to date with real-world attacks and bad actor movements?
There's no one site, I think, is the first answer. And so much of what we're talking about, cyber has become an art as much as a technical field of understanding. And one of the first things everybody has to understand, because a lot of us have dealt with government programs which are classified. The notable feature of technology is that you cannot classify good ideas. Zeros and ones are not going to be confined to any government guidance on what people think should be classified, because the internet, computers, science, you know, it has a way of just getting out there. So I think that's the first thing to recognize, is that there's no one single source. And as Krebs, this Krebs character from DHS so aptly put his foot in his mouth by saying, oh, nothing to see here. Any assessment of any system of systems takes time. You've got hardware and you got software and you got vaporware, like, you know, people are in the loop. So to analyze that on in any given day takes a great deal of understanding. And I would argue that there's no single institution, there's no single educational program, there's no single website that's going to give you everything you need. With that said, I think Pete O'Brien probably has some guidance.
No, you're exactly right, Tony. There is no one single site. I follow a particular site, ctovision.com. I'm not sure if what's to reference anything, but it's no charge. But they regularly, on a daily basis, go through and assemble a series of articles that are pertinent to the entire cybersecurity world. Each of those articles are simply items they have culled from the net. So they essentially shotgun out to a whole bunch of other sites and magazines, etc. So I would suggest that finding a couple of sites like that you're comfortable with, and then following each one of those, follow the threads to additional sites. It's that second and third order series. But that said, you're going to find information on the web and on cybersecurity virtually anywhere. It pops up in the strangest places. So really, you just need to keep your head on a swivel and watch what's passing in front of you.
Yeah,
that's it. There is no quick and easy way. At the end of the day, those of us that are involved in this probably spend certainly hours every week searching through to keep up to date on various topics. We all have various little feeds. You see something of interest, you follow the thread and see where it goes.
This one is from Andy V. Many of the nation's young voters have been clearly exposed to indoctrination all their lives, from elementary school onto academia and through their favorite television shows and, yes, the cable news programs. This includes maybe instilling negative attitudes towards certain ways to think. Still, how do we in the center and center right need to better reach young people through issues that they care about?
One of the things I've noticed in dealing with both sides of the aisle, we're a policy think tank that does not take sides, is I've dealt with a lot of folks like Tulsi Gabbard, who on the left I don't agree with on a lot of her policies, but the fundamentals of free speech and free expression are cornerstones of what she believes should be part of the political dialogue. And what's ironic is because she has such a strong belief in defending free speech and free expression, she's an enemy of what I would call the neoliberals. There's two groups that I think are the enemy of free thought, neoliberals and neocons. And this past political cycle, I think, highlighted the existence of both. Neoliberals, neocons, they're primarily known as the basic infrastructure. They're the institutional Democrats and Republicans at this point, who have essentially signed up to a process of focusing on and retaining power versus actual support of the concepts of the Constitution. So I would almost argue that embracing people like Tim Pool, some of these folks on the left who clearly don't identify with the authoritarian, big brother, we'll tell you what to think process, which is now in place and which we're seeing. So I think that's the best way to do it, is actually make friends of those who actually understand that. And then part of this is deprogramming. I often talk about the young people I know who recognize that I should be able to say what I want within reason. And yet, if I do, I get attacked, and that's dangerous. And I think that's something we should focus on, is the fact that there is no such thing as free speech or free thought within the confines of the larger. I would still argue both parties. Both parties are not all keen on this, and that's something that we have to look at, how we market to youth on this.
Well, there's also a fundamental fault with the way that many people are taught to think or brought up to think, and it really goes back sort of, almost 800 years back to the days of Francis Loyola and the Jesuits. Give me a child until he's 8, he's mine for life. But after the basic education that children need and get, the whole idea of critical thinking seems to have fallen into one great hole. That is the fact that there are two types of criticism. There is constructive criticism, where you have a debate and try and change somebody else's mind. And there is destructive criticism, in which you basically destroy your opponent. We seem to be in an era where nothing else much is put forward except destructive criticism.
Right. If I can throw in, and as a victim of 8 years of Jesuit education, I'll caveat my statement.
Put me straight if you need, Pete.
But no, Tim is correct, spot on. The root of this all lies in education, and I would say to someone who's 20 years old and is looking around trying to get his head around this problem, the first thing I'd tell you is, don't let it happen to your kids.
Yeah.
You need to really, honest to God, no kidding, be in charge of your kids' education. More than anything else, that is your legacy for the future. And I would say you need to climb up the, whatever school your kids are going to go to, you need to climb up their backside with a microscope. Don't let those teachers or the principal turn their head without getting your approval. That's why I would throw that out. But the second thing is for yourself. There are very few new thoughts on the planet. And I would say go back and do some fundamental reading in philosophy and in history. Pick some books that were written more than 100 years ago and pull them apart. See if they make sense. Read some Hobbes and read some Locke and read some Plato and read some Aristotle. And it's going to be painful, and some of it's hard reading, but it's where you're going to actually find truth.
Well, I think there's a great opportunity in today's youth, if you're talking about the future. It's a great opportunity, because when we were in school, the fight was against the establishment. That means that the Democrat, so to speak, or the leftists were anti-government. And now they have the government. So now they are ending up being the pro-establishment people, which is a great opportunity, because the natural thing for youth is to want to be anti-establishment. It's a built-in tendency of young people. And there's no reason why we can't be now shifting that and say, hey, They're the party of big government. They want to control every move you make. We're the party of freedom. We're the party of the American dream. And I mean, Charlie Kirk is doing some of that, obviously. But that seems to me a great opportunity to use the same rhetoric that built up the whole leftist world in the 1970s, with modifications and a little adaptation, can be used to build up a center-right world for the future.
Or alternatively, they could blow off what we're saying and go listen to Jay-Z and check in on the Kardashians. So yeah, it's really their call.
That's always a call. That's always an option.
Was that constructive or destructive criticism, Tony?
I think it's just
it's life its own self.
Well, for some reason, I think we should be reading Hounds of the Baskervilles or something like that. There we go.
We could do our own like Christmas interpretation of a Sherlock Holmes mystery. That would be fun.
That would be fun too. Yes, yes. I have one more question, gentlemen. This one is from Janice W. More inroads have been made in the last 4 years to improve U.S.-Israeli-Arab relations.
Yeah.
What needs to happen to continue this improvement, and what might derail the positive trend?
The first thing I would suggest is that the effort that has taken place in the last particularly 2 years to establish some bilateral relations between Israel and other countries around the Middle East, that needs to be pursued whole hog. There's a whole lot more. One of our favorite subjects here is establishing some kind of regional treaty organization for the Arab states. I think that's a follow-on, but working these bilateral relationships and getting some of those solidified is really the thing that needs to be done right now. That said, there was an article on AP this morning. I don't know if we're allowed to say AP, but it quotes Turki bin Faisal, who was the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia and who is now completely on the outs. That's the little thing that the article kind of steers around. He's completely excluded from the government and sort of pushed out of the family because of his pro-Iran position. Turki bin Faisal is lamenting the developments vis-a-vis Israel in the Arab world. And if that isn't a sign of that things are really actually going right, I don't know what is. The fact that he came out and said this needs to be slowed down and we need to take a look at the Palestinians really speaks to the fact that we're finally getting real traction between Israel and the Arab community.
Well, I just want to share with you that, you know, a lot of the Jewish sources I'm getting memes and types of videos that may not circulate as widely, but it's not just that like Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates signed a peace with Israel. They are literally giddy over there. They're so thrilled. They're so happy. They instructed every single hotel that they must have kosher food available at all times. They are hosting weddings of 10,000 people, Jewish weddings, kosher weddings. They're offering them synagogue services. They in the fruit stand, they have fruit from Israel with a big Israeli flag next to it. My sister-in-law sent that to me. She lives in Chicago. I said, you can't do that in Chicago. You cannot put up on the fruit stand an Israeli flag without getting into trouble. And here in Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, they're doing that. They are. It's not just that they're reluctantly doing it. In the past, it was reluctant peace, like with Egypt. You would go visit Egypt, and all the citizens would speak against Israel, but they were technically at peace. However, now they're giddy. They're really buying the vision of one Middle East right now, and I think Iran, has to read the tea leaves or whatever they read that.
Isn't it interesting that our founder's vision, Herb London, was one of the lead early thinkers on this? And the big problem that I see coming up is the threat of Iran to the entire region and how the US handles it as Iran gets closer and closer to nuclear capability, and cuddling up to them to get rid of that. Or if anybody believes that they aren't cheating on any deals they make to do with nukes, I've got a bridge to sell you.
Well, I hate to be the wet blanket here, but that's exactly what we have to expect, is that on the 20th of January, it's going to be a return to the bad old days should Joe Biden take the oath. And here's why. Everything President Trump is doing, while extraordinary, could have been done years ago. It was a policy choice. There was a choice made to not pursue these bilateral relationships we now see working out. We know militarily that bilateral relationships between us and others were very effective. But for whatever reason, the decision was by old Boltneck, John Kerry, and his crowd to actually, it's true. He hides them well, though. John Kerry to essentially demand that the Palestinian peace process be completed before anything else happened. I think it was totally insane. It was irrational, and frankly, was never going to be done. And they knew it. I think they knew that this was going to be a bridge that could never be accomplished the way they wanted to do it. So therefore, Trump basically rejected any of the preconceived, like, oh, you must do it this way. Well, why? And I think that why was never ever clarified by the Kerry State Department, the Clinton State Department. So again, this is extraordinary, but it's not. This is predictable. If you actually reach out and say, hey, how about you guys talk, figure out a way to resolve your differences and do it. That's what happened. And so part two of that is reestablishing the basic understanding that we are, for better or for worse, I'm not here to justify it or say that it's right or wrong. We have chosen the Arabs over the Persians as our primary partner in the Middle East. It is what it is. And I get criticized all the time because supposedly I'm pro Saudi Arabian. I'm not. I don't think we are as an institution. I'm just stating that the policy position we've had as the United States is to partner with the Arabs. That's it. That is the way it is. And when the Obama administration came in and started to cozy up with the Persians, with the Shia, not the Sunni, that caused all sorts of consternation and further bifurcation, if you will, of the relationship between the Arab nations we were working with and the Israelis. It was not helpful, and I think it was destructive to the point of where we saw the destabilization of Egypt and the failure as a state of Libya. Those things were, I think, deliberately done by the Obama administration. So that the last 4 years have been very affected by the fact that I think President Trump was respectful of the interests of the Arab nations and the Israelis. They recognized the danger of a nuclear-armed Iran and acted as such, and have been working very arduously to establish a what Herb London called, the condominium of these nations working together, the Arab NATO sort of thing. And, I think people who watch our center understand that we were influential in President Trump's thinking on this, since we were actually working with Mike Flynn in the early days of 2016 to feed this information into the Trump campaign. And I think I'm happy to say that the Trump campaign paid attention. They kept this as a policy position going into the actual administration, and all of this will be lost. The Israelis will not be honored or respected for the effort they've made to make peace with the Arab nations. The work that's been done to isolate and prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon will be, again, discouraged. You will see a return to the so-called nuclear agreement, which was not, people don't understand that the agreed upon framework of the Obama administration and the Iranians, it was not to stop them from developing a nuclear bomb. It was to delay it for 10 years. That's it. There was no real effort to stop it. It was just to delay it.
6 years ago.
So I think
4 years left to go.
Right. So those are the policy positions which I think people have tended to ignore, not our side, but the other side, because they don't want the benefit. They don't want to see a peace. And so therefore the actual effort to make peace and to bring stability to the Middle East will be lost should there be a Biden administration.
It raises an interesting point, doesn't it? That if the JCPOA does get resurrected, basically it will still be in Biden's term that Iran has legal access to a nuclear bomb.
Right.
That's not a deal.
No, it's not. So I hate to be the wet blanket on this, but all the progress that we've seen, I would argue that the assassination of the nuclear science, I'm not saying the Israelis did it. I'm saying they're anticipating if Biden becomes president, they're going to have to be a lot more aggressive in going after the Iranians on their own. Just saying.
By the way, that was an incredible operation. Oh, it's unbelievable. They blew up a car next to his car, blocked his access, shut off the video in the neighborhood, had machine guns trained on the bulletproof car, but eventually pierced it, and did it all in 3 minutes and all got away. It's mind-boggling. The class.
Yeah, well,
in Tehran, in enemy territory.
Look, I'm not someone who is soft-hearted about doing these sorts of things that are necessary to stop nuclear programs. I'm not endorsing this by any means, and I'm not saying the United States did either. I'm just saying that I believe that raid was a result of the perception of a Joe Biden administration being
on the way, looming.
Just saying.
Yep.
I want to thank you for watching this edition of Ask Us Anything from the London Center for Policy Research. I want to thank our panelists for taking part in this. And we really cannot do this without you. If you'd like to help us produce content like this and exclusive programming, please help us on our Patreon page. Our Patreon page is patreon.com/thought-to-action. That's patreon.com/thought-to-action. What also would help us out is please comment. Tell us what you think. Like the video and spread the word. Share this with your friends and share this with your network on social media. If you'd like to find out more about Thought to Action and the work the London Center does, visit our website at londoncenter.org.